Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flip classroom in our discussion of absolutism in France, right? Yes, so, oh my God, my voice is squeaking. Okay, I'm going to have to calm it down a little bit just to prevent my voice from going out on me and stuff like that. So we spent the bulk of class today talking about a large amount of review stuff, talked about Cardinal Richelieu, and we talked about the growing power of the Bourbon dynasty, right? So the big things that we discussed was how Cardinal Richelieu set in place certain systems that Louis Dudon, king or like gift of God, would come in and use, right? Now, one of the biggest things that we discussed about Louis XIV has to do with the creation of his Palace of Versailles, right? We talked about its Baroque architecture, we discussed all of its rooms, and its large spanning complex, which spans over 700 different individual rooms. Also, a couple of y'all are going to Europe this summer on our study, or like not our study abroad trip, but the foreign language study abroad trip and stuff like that. And so you'll get to see so many of these things, right? You'll get to see the Hall of Mirrors, Louis's bedrooms, like all the common rooms, the pink room, the green room, all that different stuff. And you'll get to see the beautiful Baroque stylings of the painted ceilings and all of these other masterpiece works that exist inside of, again, this over 700 different rooms. There's over 1,000 pieces of furniture. And also, one of the coolest things is there are absolutely no bathrooms. There are absolutely no bathrooms whatsoever in the Palace of Versailles due to the fact that they still use chamber pots and didn't have plumbing. All right, so now look. But going into it, though, we discussed the creation of this and his ability to separate himself from the nobility in general, right? We talked about the Fronde rebellions a little bit. Talked about how he almost died, of course, due to all these different like assaults on his power and how basically he faked sleeping one time and a bunch of them left. But the creation of this palace gave Louis the ability to extend his power further than anybody ever had, right? So the power of Louis XIV is a very, very serious thing, right? First and foremost, he did what is known as ruled from home, right? The Palace of Versailles was the centralized location of his throne, his energy, and also of his absolute reign that occurred in France, right? The eminence himself, well, not the eminence, the red eminence is Cardinal Richelieu, as we know. The Sun King himself ruled completely from the halls of the Palace of Versailles and the establishment of this thing known as his royal court, right? His royal court, of course, okay, when you're talking about court and court life, royal courts is basically the large group of nobles that he would keep basically begging at his feet, right? So a big thing about it in general is court or court life has to do going back to the Renaissance era and how nobles and rich, wealthy people would do what's known as hold court, right? Holding court, of course, referring to the idea of people coming to a rich person's home to see them, to party with them, to hang out with music playing in the background, dancing, drinking, and revelry of a sort, right? So the big thing about it, though, is that we talked about this in the Renaissance, right? We talked about Balthasar's Castiglione writing the courtier, which is, of course, is a big thing about, like, being a courtier. It means you're somebody who can advise a king because you're a part of his court, right? Well, the royal court that Louis XIV constructed inside the Palace of Versailles is actually a massive council of princes and nobles that carried out all of his policies while he lived at his house, right? So he had the ability to talk to all these different princes and nobles that actually lived at his house with him for at least 30% of the year, right? Now, I don't mean that for like, 2/3 of the year that there was nobody else in there with him. I meant that they were rotating through constantly, right? So there were these nobles that lived at his home with him, right? So if we look at this picture of him right here as well, that right there, of course, is Louis XIV. And look at the cavalcade of nobles that are actually on the stairs watching him address this other noble that is coming before him, who happens to be a sword noble, right? So something that you need to understand as well about the growth of French society is that there are two types of noble that existed in France, right? This all actually started with Henry IV, Louis XIV's grandfather, and they actually are what's known as sword nobles and robe nobles, right? Now, sword nobles are former members of the military or nobility that had earned their right, prestige, tradition, honor, and hereditary lands through military service, right? Going back sometimes generations. So we'll talk about one very famous sword noble a little bit later on, a man by the known as the Marquis de Lafayette, which of course the city of Lafayette is of course named after him, right? Now, interesting fact is it was originally known as Vermilionville. Now, going into it though, that sword noble, as you see bowing before the king, they are ones that actually earned those rights through military prestige. They were also the only people in French society that were allowed to carry an open weapon, of course being a sword, that they were allowed to actually carry around with them. Now, a big thing about it, though, is Louis did not particularly like the sword nobles, right? Because those are the people that led the Fronde rebellions against him when he was a very, very young man. He instead actually sold more rights of robe nobility to more people, okay? So what do I mean by selling? That's what makes a robe noble a robe noble. You could buy your way into the nobility, and when you did buy your way into the nobility, you got a break from taxes, you didn't have to pay nearly as much as in taxes, and you got hereditary rights and lands, right? And so with that, when you bought your way into the nobility, you could actually be there under his thumb, right? Robe nobles would do anything they could to be closer to Louis, to suck up to him, right? So for example, one of the best jobs you could have as a robe noble is helping him pick out the shirt that he was going to wear, either going to bed or waking up in the morning. Literally, people would stand near his bed, and when he woke in the morning, they would just, oh, clap for him, and be like, oh, you're just the best. Look at you waking up. You're the best. Oh my God. They also, apparently, one of the best jobs as well was helping him go to the bathroom, or helping him eat, or take off his riding boots in the evenings. Literally, the guy would come down the stairs and people would clap for him. Those were the robe nobles that lived at his royal court, that would do his bidding and carry out all of his policies, right? Now, another big thing that you need to understand about Louis XIV is he was an uber Catholic, right? Now, as in uber, as in very extreme. Now, the big thing about it, though, is like, as a very, very strong Catholic, he greatly disliked Huguenots, even though, ironically enough, his grandfather was one. The big thing about it, though, is he actually destroyed Huguenot churches, schools, and tried to force conversion, causing a huge amount of Huguenots to actually leave the country of France and run away. He also is going to do something very, very big and important. He is going to revoke the Edict of Nantes, right? The Edict of Nantes, the document that said that Huguenots were allowed to practice freely inside of France, is going to be revoked by Louis XIV, even though, again, his grandfather is the one that brought it into power, of course, Henry IV, i.e. Henry the Great, right? So going into it, though, as well, his royal court that existed from him within Versailles is very, very important. And it's basically the epitome of why, or the epitome of why, Louis XIV is considered the absolutist, right? He would force robe nobles to come and watch his ballets. He would force robe nobles to enact his policies. He would use the intendants set up by Cardinal Richelieu to enforce any kind of jurisdictional idea that he wanted to do. Now, how was he able to pay for all this, though, right? So we got to talk about his finances. So the biggest thing that you need to understand about Louis XIV is he spent basically the entire French budget on his palaces and funding his royal court. Also, he's going to adopt mercantilism, right? Now, mercantilism is very, very important. First of all, it was established by his advisor, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Now, the big thing about it, though, is mercantilism is that key concept of exporting more than you import and hoarding as much money as possible inside of your own country. So Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his financial advisor and robe noble himself, came up to Louis XIV and said, you have to understand that as Spain grows in liquidity and as they bring in more gold and silver into their borders, as every other country in this area begins to colonize and make more money, we need to do our best effort to try and hold on to as much gold and silver inside of this country as possible. And we need to try and do that by refusing to actually bring in foreign items. We need to actually export more than we import, because if you are exporting, you are receiving payment for an item, whereas if you are importing, you are paying for something. And if I spend $1 and it goes to England, it's going to get melted down and turned into a pound sterling rather than being a franc, right? So the idea, though, that was propagated to him was conserve and hoard as much money inside of the country as possible. That means he's going to increase tariffs, and a big thing as well that's going to happen under Louis XIV is the outlawing of certain foreign products, right? For example, write this down, Louis outlawed English tobacco. He also outlawed English cotton textiles, right? Because he was trying to force French people to buy products from France to keep that money hoarded inside of his country, right? So mercantilism is a big thing that he adopted that is going to be very, very big in the adoption and the understanding of Louis XIV going forward. He's also eventually going to die at the ripe old age of his 70s with a tremendous amount of debt, right? Having multiple different wives and things like that. But the big thing, not at the same time, but the big thing about it in general is he died mostly with a lot of debt due to the fact that he started more wars than you can imagine. And he was in power for 54 years. 54 years of reign, right? Now, in his 54 years of reign, though, he literally was at war for 33 of them, right? that is absolutely bananas. That's absolutely crazy. The idea that a guy that ruled into his 70s, that died in 1715, literally had that much time and power to lead many different wars. But the problem is he lost a couple on the back end, right? One of the biggest ones he, of course, lost on the back end was this thing called the War of Spanish Succession. Do y'all remember King Carlos II, the ugly Habsburg guy that was the last Habsburg of Spain? When he died, it left an opening on the throne. The person that ended up getting the throne is Louis's grandson, Philip V, right? And so the big thing about it is Louis tried to exert his power, try to grow his holdings, try to gobble up as much land and territory in Spain as possible. The rest of Europe coalesced together, fought against him, and crushed his forces, right? This is going to leave him with a tremendous amount of debt going forward, and it's going to help lead into that French Revolution. But now what we're going to do is we're going to take a break right here, and we're going to talk about Russia, okay? So go ahead and give me a nice big title, a nice big fat Russia in your notes, so we can talk about this stuff a little bit more when I see y'all soon, because we're going to talk about Ivan, a.k.a. Ivan the Terrible, and talk about Russia during the late 1500s, okay? But we'll talk to y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.